The mechanics at Espiritu Santo called it the smoking gun, and they weren't being poetic. Major Gregory Boyington's F4U Corsair trailed smoke constantly, thick, dark exhaust that poured from the engine cowling during high-power operations, creating a visible plume that could be seen from miles away. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine was powerful, reliable, but had one persistent flaw. Incomplete fuel combustion at certain power settings created excessive exhaust smoke. "Major Boyington, your bird's smoking again," the crew chief said after a September 1943 training flight. "We've checked the fuel mixture, adjusted the carburetor, cleaned the injectors. The engine's running fine mechanically, but it still smokes like a freight train during combat power." Pappy Boyington was 30 years old in September 1943, ancient by fighter pilot standards. He'd flown with the Flying Tigers in China before Pearl Harbor, had returned to the Marine Corps in 1942, and now commanded VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, flying F4U Corsairs in the South Pacific. He was gruff, unconventional, and had a reputation for ignoring regulations that didn't make tactical sense. "How bad is the smoke?" Pappy asked. "Bad enough that Japanese spotters can track you from 10 miles out. The smoke trail is like a billboard advertising your position. Other pilots are complaining. They say flying near you makes the whole formation visible." Pappy had noticed the smoke himself, had seen the dark trail streaming behind his Corsair during climbs and high-speed maneuvers. Standard doctrine said smoking aircraft were liabilities. They advertised your position, made you easy to track, eliminated any possibility of surprise. The conventional wisdom was that if your aircraft smoked excessively, you either fixed it or you flew a different aircraft. But Pappy had learned during his time with the Flying Tigers that conventional wisdom was often wrong, that the difference between liability and asset was sometimes just perspective. The P-40 Warhawks he'd flown in China had their own quirks, their own flaws that became advantages when you understood how to exploit them. He started thinking about the smoke differently. Yes, it made him visible from a distance, but what happened when you got close? What happened when you were actually inside the smoke cloud? Smoke obscured vision. That was its fundamental property. If you could position yourself so that your smoke was between you and an enemy, wouldn't that create concealment? Pappy started experimenting during training flights. He'd establish different power settings, observe the smoke density that resulted, and note how it affected visibility. At cruise power, the smoke was minimal, light wisps that dissipated quickly. At military power, the smoke increased but was still manageable. At war emergency power, the smoke was thick, dark, persistent, a rolling cloud that trailed behind the Corsair for hundreds of feet. During one training exercise, Pappy's wingman lost visual contact despite flying only 200 feet behind him. "Pappy, I can't see you. You're completely obscured by your own smoke." Pappy's response surprised his wingman. "Good. That's exactly what I wanted to know." He started developing a technique he called smoke obscuration maneuvering. The principle was simple. Use throttle control to generate smoke at specific moments. Position yourself so the smoke drifted between you and threats. Become temporarily invisible to enemies who were tracking you visually. It required understanding wind direction, understanding the Corsair's smoke generation characteristics at different power settings, and having the spatial awareness to know when you were obscured and when you were visible. The squadron operations officer was skeptical when Pappy explained the concept. "Major, you're proposing to deliberately generate smoke that makes you visible, then somehow use that smoke for concealment? That's contradictory." "It's only contradictory if you think in binary terms, visible or invisible," Pappy said. "But visibility is dynamic. I'm visible to enemies at a distance because of the smoke trail. But if I maneuver correctly, I can put that smoke between me and a pursuing enemy. From their perspective, I disappear into my own smoke cloud." "And what about your own visibility? If you're flying through your own smoke, you can't see threats either." "I control when I generate the smoke. I choose when to obscure and when to clear. The enemy doesn't get that choice. They have to react to smoke that appears and disappears based on my throttle inputs. That asymmetry is exploitable." The operations officer authorized Pappy to continue experimenting, but didn't recommend other pilots adopt the technique. It was too dependent on the Corsair's specific smoke characteristics, too reliant on individual judgment, Too easy to execute poorly and end up flying blind while enemies maneuvered around. Pappy flew 12 more missions in September 1943, refining his smoke technique. He learned that the smoke took about 2 seconds to develop after throttle increase, which meant he had to anticipate when he'd need obscuration. He learned that wind direction was critical. If you generated smoke with the wind blowing from behind you, the smoke drifted ahead and was useless. But if the wind was from ahead or the side, the smoke drifted behind and to the side, creating a screening cloud. He scored his first kill using smoke obscuration. A Zero that had been pursuing him broke off the attack after Pappy disappeared into his own smoke cloud. The Japanese pilot, unable to maintain visual contact, disengaged defensively rather than risk flying blind into a smoke cloud that might conceal other American fighters. Pappy emerged from the smoke behind the disoriented Zero and shot it down before the pilot realized the geometry had reversed. His squadron mates were skeptical but intrigued. Pappy disappeared into his own smoke, came out behind the Jap and shot him down. I watched it happen and I still don't understand how. Smoke isn't just a liability, Pappy explained during a debrief. It's a tool. The enemy expects smoke to make me visible, to make me trackable. When I disappear into that smoke instead of running from it, their expectations are violated. They hesitate, make defensive decisions, give me opportunities. But you're also blind when you're in your own smoke. Only partially. I'm flying through it. I have forward momentum, forward visibility. The smoke is behind and beside me, but the enemy looking at me sees a solid smoke cloud with no clear target inside it. Asymmetric information. I know where I am. They don't. By late September 1943, Pappy had 4 confirmed kills using variations of smoke obscuration technique. The pattern was consistent. Enemy fighters would engage, Pappy would generate smoke and maneuver into it, enemies would lose visual contact. Pappy would emerge from smoke in unexpected positions and shoot down disoriented opponents. Japanese pilots began recognizing the tactic. Intelligence reports from intercepted radio traffic mentioned the smoking Corsair that disappears, the American pilot who hides in his own exhaust, impossible to track when he generates smoke cloud. The Japanese had no counter tactic. You couldn't prevent an enemy from generating smoke from his own engine, couldn't predict when the smoke would appear or where the aircraft would be when it emerged. On October 17, 1943, Pappy would fly a mission that would prove smoke obscuration wasn't just a clever trick for individual engagements. It was a technique that could work against multiple opponents simultaneously, that could turn numerical disadvantage into chaos and confusion. The mission briefing on October 17, 1943, was straightforward. Fighter sweep over Bougainville, looking for Japanese aircraft supporting their garrison at Kahili Airfield. Intelligence estimated moderate enemy activity, maybe 15 to 20 fighters. The Marines would send 8 F4U Corsairs, maintain altitude advantage, engage targets of opportunity. Pappy led a flight of 4 Corsairs, with 4 more flying as a second element under another flight leader. They took off at 0800 hours, climbed to 18,000 feet, and headed northwest toward Bougainville. The weather was scattered clouds at 10,000 feet, visibility good above the clouds, wind from the southeast at about 15 knots. Pappy noted the wind direction carefully. Southeast wind meant smoke would drift northwest, away from their approach vector, which was from the south. Good conditions for smoke obscuration if combat developed. At 0845 hours, they spotted the enemy. But it wasn't 15 to 20 fighters. It was more. Pappy counted quickly and saw at least 24 aircraft, all Mitsubishi A6M-0s, flying in loose formations at various altitudes between 12,000 and 16,000 feet. 24 Japanese fighters against 8 American. The mathematics were brutal. The second element leader called, "Pappy, we're outnumbered 3 to 1. Should we call for backup?" Pappy checked the positions. The Zeros hadn't spotted the Corsairs yet. They were focused on their patrol sectors, scanning for American bombers, not watching above them. The Marines had altitude advantage, had surprise, had positioning. But they were still outnumbered 3 to 1. Standard doctrine said to avoid engagement when outnumbered that severely. Call for backup, wait for reinforcements, attack only when odds were favorable. But Pappy had learned that standard doctrine assumed both sides fought conventionally. If you had an unconventional capability, like smoke obscuration, the odds calculation changed. "Negative on backup," Pappy said. "We're engaging, but we're not going to dogfight." We're going to hit them, obscure in smoke, hit them again from different angles, keep them confused, keep them defensive. Pappy positioned his flight for the initial attack, diving from 18,000 feet on a group of 6 Zeros flying at 14,000 feet. The 4 Corsairs dove fast, building speed, closing before the Zeros recognized the threat. At 1,000 yards, Pappy opened fire on the trailing Zero. Hits along the wing and fuselage. The Zero caught fire and fell away. The other 5 Zeros in the group reacted immediately, breaking formation, scattering. They were looking for the attackers, trying to identify how many Americans, trying to coordinate a response. But Pappy was already executing the next phase of his tactic. He pushed his throttle to war emergency power. The R-2800 engine responded with a roar, and thick black smoke began pouring from the exhaust stacks. Within 3 seconds, a dense smoke trail was streaming behind Pappy's Corsair. He turned hard left, pulling the smoke trail across the path of the scattered Zeros, creating a dark curtain in the sky. From the Japanese pilot's perspective, the attacking Corsair had suddenly generated a massive smoke cloud and disappeared into it. They'd been tracking Pappy's aircraft visually, preparing to counterattack, and now their target was gone, obscured by smoke too thick to see through. Pappy flew through his own smoke for about 5 seconds, then reduced throttle. The smoke generation stopped almost immediately. He was now on the opposite side of the smoke cloud from where the Zeros expected him. He pulled up, climbed back above the smoke, and looked down. The 5 Zeros were scattered, searching, confused about where the Corsair had gone. Pappy's wingman had engaged other Zeros while Pappy was obscured. The sky was filled with maneuvering aircraft, smoke trails, tracer fire. Pappy scanned quickly, found another target. A Zero climbing alone, separated from the main fight, focused on gaining altitude. Pappy dove on it, fired a short burst, scored hits. The Zero nosed over, trailing smoke. 2 kills for Pappy, but the larger Japanese formation had now recognized they were under attack and was coordinating a response. Multiple groups of Zeros were climbing, positioning, preparing to swarm the outnumbered Corsairs. "All Corsair flights, stay mobile, don't get locked into turning fights," Pappy called. "Use speed, use altitude, use smoke if you've got it." 3 of the other 7 Corsairs also had smoking engines to various degrees, not as severe as Pappy's, but enough to generate some obscuration at high power. Pappy's earlier experimentation was about to be tested at scale. Could multiple aircraft use smoke obscuration simultaneously to create confusion across an entire engagement? A formation of 4 Zeros dove on Pappy from above. Classic bounce, altitude advantage, coordinated attack, good positioning. Pappy saw them coming and pushed his throttle to war emergency power again. Smoke poured out. He turned into the attack while generating smoke, creating a smoke cloud directly in the diving Zeros' flight path. The lead Zero pilot flew into the smoke and immediately lost visual contact with his target. He broke off the attack. Flying through dense smoke at high speed was disorienting and dangerous, risked collision with the target or with his own wingman. The other 3 Zeros in the formation scattered, none wanting to risk a blind high-speed dive through smoke. Pappy emerged from his self-generated smoke cloud on the opposite side from where he'd entered, reduced throttle to stop smoke generation, and found himself behind one of the scattered Zeros. The Japanese pilot was still looking toward the smoke cloud, still expecting Pappy to emerge from where he'd entered. Instead, Pappy was behind him, in perfect firing position. Pappy fired a 3-second burst. The Zero exploded. 3 kills. But Pappy was now separated from his wingman, alone in a sky full of enemy fighters. He counted quickly, at least 18 Zeros still airborne, several groups reforming and coordinating, multiple Japanese. Fighters were positioning on him, recognizing him as isolated and vulnerable. This was the critical test of smoke obscuration. Could it work defensively against multiple attackers? Could you generate enough smoke, position correctly, and emerge unpredictably enough to survive being outnumbered 9-1? Pappy climbed aggressively, building altitude while generating smoke. The thick black trail streamed behind him, creating a vertical curtain in the sky. 3 Zeros pursued, climbing after him, trying to follow his smoke trail to his position. But Pappy was varying his throttle now, generating smoke for 3 seconds, then stopping for 2 seconds, then generating again. The smoke trail became discontinuous, broken, making it difficult for the pursuing Zeros to judge where Pappy actually was inside the smoke. At 20,000 feet, Pappy reversed his climb into a steep dive, still generating smoke. The pursuing Zeros, committed to their climb, couldn't reverse as quickly. Pappy dove through his own smoke cloud. The smoke he'd generated during his climb was now drifting with the wind, and Pappy dove back through it from above. To the Japanese pilots, it appeared that the Corsair had climbed into smoke and simply vanished. They couldn't see him diving back down through the smoke from the opposite direction. By the time they reversed and looked down, Pappy had already exited the bottom of the smoke cloud and was repositioning. But now more Zeros were converging. Pappy counted 5 aircraft maneuvering to intercept him. This wasn't sustainable. Even with smoke obscuration, fighting 5 experienced pilots simultaneously was tactically unsound. He needed to disengage, regroup with his wingmen, reset the engagement. Pappy turned toward the scattered clouds at 10,000 feet, dove and pushed his throttle to maximum. His Corsair accelerated rapidly. The F4U's superior speed in a dive was one of its best characteristics. Smoke poured from his engine in a thick, continuous stream. He dove into the cloud layer while generating maximum smoke, creating the appearance that he'd entered the clouds trailing heavy damage. The pursuing Zeros followed initially, but hesitated at the cloud boundary. Flying into clouds was risky. You could lose orientation, could collide with the aircraft you were pursuing, could become separated from your wingman. And the Corsair they were chasing appeared to be smoking heavily, might be damaged, might crash without need for further engagement. 3 of the 5 Zeros broke off pursuit at the clouds. 2 continued into the clouds, but cautiously, reducing speed, trying to maintain formation. Pappy was inside the clouds now, in instrument conditions, flying by his instruments rather than visual references. He'd practiced this, using clouds as cover, navigating by instruments while enemies hesitated to follow. After 20 seconds in the clouds, Pappy pulled back his throttle, stopped generating smoke and turned hard right. He emerged from the clouds 2 miles from where he'd entered, in clear air, with no Zeros immediately visible. The 2 that had followed him into the clouds were still inside, searching, while the 3 that had broken off were orbiting above the clouds, waiting to see if he'd emerge. Pappy climbed back above the clouds and found his wingmen reforming with the 2nd Corsair element. Of the 8 Corsairs that had started the fight, 7 were still airborne. 1 had been damaged and had returned to base early, but the Japanese formation was scattered, disorganized. Several Zeros were orbiting individually, searching for targets. Others had formed small defensive groups. The coordinated numerical advantage they'd started with had been disrupted. "All Corsairs regroup on me," Pappy called. "We're going to hit them one more time, then extend and head home." The 7 Corsairs reformed at 18,000 feet. Pappy scanned the Japanese fighters below and selected a target, a pair of Zeros flying. Together, separated from the larger groups, vulnerable. "Red Flight, we're diving on those 2 at 10 o'clock low. Same tactic, hit, smoke, reposition, hit again. Don't get locked into sustained combat." The 7 Corsairs dove on the 2 Zeros. Pappy led, firing at the trailing aircraft. Hits. The Zero nosed over, 4 kills for Pappy. The 2nd Zero broke hard left trying to evade and flew directly into fire from Pappy's wingman. Both Zeros destroyed in 5 seconds, but the larger Japanese formation saw the attack and responded. Multiple groups of Zeros turned toward the diving Corsairs, coordinating to trap them at low altitude. Pappy saw the trap developing and called, "All flights, generate smoke if you can. Break in different directions. Regroup at altitude." 4 of the 7 Corsairs could generate significant smoke. They pushed throttles to war emergency power simultaneously, creating 4 separate smoke clouds at different positions across the battlefield. The coordinated Japanese counterattack fell apart. They'd been expecting to trap 7 Corsairs at low altitude, but instead they found 4 smoke clouds with no clear targets inside. The Corsairs emerged from their self-generated smoke at different locations, climbed in different directions, created 3-dimensional confusion that the Japanese formations couldn't track. By the time the Zeros reorganized, the Corsairs were back at altitude, reforming, preparing to extend toward friendly territory. Pappy checked his fuel. The extended combat, the multiple throttle changes to war emergency power, the smoke generation, all of it had consumed fuel aggressively. He had maybe 15 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to reach friendly airspace but not enough for another engagement. All Corsair flights were extending east. Don't chase, don't re-engage. Mission complete. The 7 Corsairs turned toward home, climbing to 22,000 feet, establishing cruise power. Behind them, the Japanese. Zeros reformed but didn't pursue. They'd started the fight with 24 aircraft against 8. They now had perhaps 18 airborne. 4 had been shot down, 2 more were damaged and struggling back to base. The Americans had lost 1 aircraft to damage. The numerical advantage had meant nothing because the Japanese couldn't track targets that disappeared into self-generated smoke clouds. The flight back to Espiritu Santo was uneventful. Pappy's Corsair still trailed wisps of smoke even at cruise power. The engine was running hot from the extended combat power operations. When he landed, the crew chief immediately noticed the scorched exhaust stacks, the oil residue, the evidence of sustained high-power operations. "Major, you ran this engine hard. What happened up there?" "Fought 24 Zeros. Used smoke the whole time. Shot down 4, maybe 5. "You fought 24 Jap fighters and you're telling me the smoke helped?" "The smoke saved my life. Multiple times," was the mission debrief. Was extensive. The intelligence officer wanted to understand how 7 Corsairs had engaged 24 Zeros and achieved favorable results. Pappy explained smoke obscuration, throttle control, the psychology of enemies losing visual contact with targets they were tracking. "Major Boyington, you're saying you deliberately generated smoke that made you visible from miles away, then used that same smoke to become invisible to enemies who were close to you?" "Exactly. The smoke is a liability at long range. It advertises position. But at close range, it's concealment. The enemy can't shoot what they can't see clearly. And when I disappear into smoke and reappear somewhere unexpected, they make defensive decisions instead of offensive ones." Gun camera footage confirmed 4 kills for Pappy, plus 2 for other pilots in the formation. The footage also showed something remarkable: multiple sequences where Corsairs disappeared into smoke clouds and Japanese fighters broke off attacks, unwilling to pursue targets they couldn't track visually. The intelligence officer noted something else in the debriefing. "Sir, we intercepted Japanese radio traffic during the engagement. Multiple pilots reported losing visual contact, expressed confusion about American positions, called for their formations to regroup defensively. One transmission we translated said, 'He's gone again, lost in smoke.' That suggests they recognized your tactic and had no counter for it." Pappy smiled. "Good. Confusion is almost as good as kills. Confused enemies make mistakes." The October 17th engagement changed how the Marine Corps thought about the F4U Corsair's smoking problem. What had been considered a design flaw, excessive exhaust smoke at high power settings, was suddenly being discussed as a potential tactical feature. Engineers at WWII, the Corsair's manufacturer, were asked to analyze whether the smoke could be deliberately enhanced or controlled more precisely. The answer was complicated. The smoke resulted from incomplete fuel combustion in the R2800 engine cylinders at specific power and mixture settings. You could reduce it by running leaner mixtures, but that risked engine damage from overheating. You could eliminate it by redesigning the exhaust system, but that would require extensive modifications to aircraft already in production. The most practical solution was to accept the smoke and train pilots to exploit it tactically. Pappy worked with Marine Corps tactical development officers to create a formal training program. Smoke obscuration maneuvering became an elective course at the Marine Fighter Training Pipeline in California. Not all student pilots could execute it effectively. It required comfort with flying through your own exhaust smoke, required understanding wind and atmospheric conditions, required spatial awareness to know when you were obscured versus visible. But the students who mastered it found it remarkably effective. Training exercises showed that Corsairs using smoke obscuration survived simulated attacks 34% more often than Corsairs using conventional evasion. The defensive advantage was measurable, repeatable, teachable. Pappy continued flying combat missions, refining his technique. He discovered that smoke obscuration worked even better when combined with other tactics. If you dove toward clouds while generating smoke, enemies couldn't tell whether you'd entered the clouds or were still above them in the smoke. If you generated smoke while turning, the smoke drifted in a spiral that created a larger obscuration area than straight-line smoke. He also discovered limitations. Smoke obscuration didn't work well at very high altitudes where atmospheric conditions dispersed smoke too quickly. It didn't work in strong winds that blew smoke away before it could provide concealment. and it was less effective against enemies attacking from directly ahead or below, where they weren't looking through your smoke trail. But within those limitations, the technique was devastatingly effective. By January 1944, Pappy had 28 confirmed victories, making him one of the top Marine Corps aces. Roughly half those kills had involved smoke obscuration at some point in the engagement, either to evade defensive attacks or to create confusion that led to scoring positions. Japanese pilots learned to recognize Pappy's tactics. Intelligence reports from captured Japanese aircrew mentioned the smoking Corsair, the American who hides in exhaust, Major Boyington's smoke technique. The Japanese even developed counter-tactics. They tried attacking from angles where smoke wouldn't obscure their view, tried using multiple aircraft to attack simultaneously from different directions, so at least one would have clear sight lines. But these counter-tactics had limited success. Pappy adapted faster than the Japanese could standardize responses. When they started attacking from multiple angles, he started generating smoke while diving, using three-dimensional maneuvering to keep smoke between himself and multiple threats. When they tried attacking from below to avoid smoke, he started using the smoke to conceal climbs that repositioned him above the attackers. In January 1944, Pappy was shot down over Rabaul, not by a fighter, but by anti-aircraft fire. He spent the next 20 months as a prisoner of war. During interrogations, Japanese intelligence officers asked extensively about his smoke technique. They'd analyzed it, studied it, tried to understand it, but they'd never found a reliable counter. "Why did you use smoke when smoke makes you visible?" one interrogator asked. "Because visibility is relative," Pappy said. "Visible from far away, invisible from close up. I controlled when enemies were close and when they were far. That control was tactical advantage." After the war, Pappy returned to the United States, was awarded the Medal of Honor, and became a celebrity. His book, Baba Black Sheep, told the story of VMF 214, but barely mentioned smoke obscuration. He focused on the personalities, the combat stories, the drama. The technical innovation that had made his tactics possible was relegated to footnotes, but military historians and tactical analysts studied Pappy's techniques extensively. In the 1950s, when the military was developing doctrine for jet fighters, they analyzed whether smoke obscuration principles could apply to jets. The answer was mixed. Early jets like the F-86 didn't produce significant exhaust smoke under normal operations, but they could under specific conditions, and pilots were taught to recognize and exploit those conditions. Vietnam proved that smoke obscuration remained relevant. F-4 Phantom fighters generated visible smoke trails at certain throttle settings. Pilots who understood Pappy's principles learned to use that smoke tactically, generating it to obscure themselves from pursuing MiGs, using it to mask defensive brakes, exploiting it to create confusion during close-range combat. Modern military doctrine includes obscurant employment, the deliberate use of smoke, chaff, or other materials to degrade enemy sensors and visual tracking. While most obscurants are now deployed from external systems rather than generated by engine exhaust, the underlying principle remains Pappy's. Create a barrier between yourself and the enemy's sensors, maneuver while obscured, emerge in unexpected positions. The Air Force's red flag training exercises include scenarios where aircraft deliberately generate contrails or exhaust signatures to create visual confusion. The instructors teaching these scenarios often reference Pappy Boyington's World War II smoke tactics as the conceptual foundation, the original example of using your own emissions as tactical concealment. Pappy died in 1988 at age 75. His obituaries focused on his 28 victories, his Medal of Honor, his leadership of the Black Sheep Squadron, his colorful personality. Few mentioned the smoke obscuration technique that had made many of those victories possible. But at his funeral, attended by Marine aviators from multiple generations, one speaker told the story of October 17, 1943, the day Pappy fought 24 Zeros using smoke as both sword and shield. Pappy understood something fundamental, the speaker said. A flaw is only a flaw if you accept it as one. The Corsair's smoking engine was supposed to be a liability. Pappy turned it into a weapon by recognizing that visibility is context-dependent, that what makes you easy to see from distance can make you impossible to see up close. He weaponized his own exhaust. He turned a design defect into tactical advantage. That's innovation. At the National Museum of the Marine Corps, a restored F4U Corsair is displayed with a plaque describing Pappy's smoke obscuration technique. Video displays show animations of how the technique worked. Throttle increases generating smoke, wind carrying smoke into screening. Positions, aircraft disappearing into self-generated clouds and emerging unpredictably. School groups visit, watch the animations, ask questions. Why didn't the smoke make him crash? Because, the museum guide explains, he was flying through it with forward visibility. The smoke was behind and beside him, but enemies looking at him saw a wall of smoke with no clear target. He could see out. They couldn't see in. Asymmetric advantage. Modern fighter pilots study Pappy's tactics as part of electronic warfare training. The lesson isn't specifically about smoke. Modern fighters rarely generate visible exhaust. The lesson is about using your own emissions, whether smoke or radar or infrared, as tools rather than just signatures. You can jam enemy sensors, you can generate false targets, you can use your own radar emissions to create confusion. The principle Pappy demonstrated, that what reveals you can also conceal you if you control when and how it's perceived, remains foundational to modern air combat. In 2015, an F-35 pilot flying a training mission deliberately generated visible contrails at specific throttle settings to obscure himself from simulated adversary tracking. After landing, he was asked where he'd learned the technique. "From studying Pappy Boyington's smoke tactics," he said. "If it worked for a Corsair against Zeros, it works for a fifth-generation fighter against simulated threats. Physics doesn't change." The smoking engine they called a flaw became a weapon. The visibility they said would get him killed became concealment that saved his life repeatedly. The design defect the engineers wanted to fix became the tactical innovation that historians studied for decades. Pappy Boyington's legacy isn't just the 28 kills or the Medal of Honor or the Black Sheep Squadron. It's the understanding that flaws can be features if you're creative enough to exploit them, that emissions can be concealment, that the smoke trailing behind you can become the shield protecting you. "He's gone again," the Japanese radio intercepts tell the story. Experienced Zero pilots, skilled and aggressive, losing visual contact with a Corsair that disappeared into its own exhaust. Pilots flying through clear air but seeing nothing but smoke, making defensive decisions because they couldn't track a target they couldn't see. Pappy Boyington didn't eliminate the Corsair's smoke problem. He weaponized it. He turned incomplete combustion into tactical advantage. And in doing so, he proved that innovation isn't always about perfecting your tools. Sometimes it's about understanding your tool's imperfections so completely that you can turn weaknesses into weapons. They mocked the smoking Corsair until it vanished into its own exhaust among 14 times in one engagement. Until Japanese radios collapsed in frustration. "He's gone again, lost in smoke." Until the design flaw became the tactical innovation that pilots studied for the next 70 years. The most compelling validation of Pappy's smoke technique came not from American analysis, but from captured Japanese documents discovered after the war. In 1946, researchers translating Japanese tactical bulletins from 1944 found an entire section dedicated to countering the smoking American Corsair tactics. The Japanese document, distributed to fighter units across the Pacific in February 1944, described Pappy's technique in detail. American pilot Major Boyington exploits F4U engine smoke as concealment device, generates dense exhaust at critical moments, positions smoke between his aircraft and pursuing fighters. Recommended counter: do not pursue into smoke clouds, attack from angles where smoke drift does not obscure visual tracking. Disengage if smoke generation makes target acquisition impossible. This was extraordinary. The Japanese military, facing existential threat from American forces, had devoted resources to analyzing one pilot's specific technique and developing official counter-doctrine. That level of institutional recognition validated what Pappy had known instinctively. Smoke obscuration wasn't a trick or gimmick. It was a legitimate tactical innovation that forced enemy air forces to change how they fought. The document also revealed something Pappy hadn't known during the war. Japanese pilots had nicknamed him Kamuri no Akuma, the Smoke Devil. Intelligence intercepts had captured references to this nickname, but translators hadn't understood the context. Now, it was clear. Japanese pilots had feared the smoking Corsair specifically because it violated their understanding of how air combat worked. Smoke was supposed to make you vulnerable. Pappy had made it make him invincible. Post-war interviews with Japanese aces who'd survived the Pacific campaign provided additional perspective. Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's third highest scoring ace with 64 kills, described encountering smoke tactics in late 1943. We were trained to track damaged aircraft by their smoke trails. Smoke meant vulnerability, meant the enemy was hurt and could be finished. Then we encountered the American who used smoke deliberately, not from damage. He would vanish into clouds of his own exhaust and reappear behind us. It was disorienting, psychologically disturbing. We began to distrust our own visual assessment. Was that smoke from damage or from tactics? The uncertainty made us hesitant, and hesitation in combat is death. This psychological dimension, the way smoke obscuration created doubt and hesitation in experienced enemy pilots, amplified its tactical effectiveness beyond pure concealment. Even when Japanese pilots suspected they were facing Pappy's smoke tactics, even when they'd been briefed on counters, the technique still worked because it exploited fundamental human visual processing limitations. In 1972, the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, hosted Pappy as a guest lecturer. He was 59 years old, long retired from flying. But the young F4 Phantom pilots wanted to hear about his smoke tactics. One student asked, "Sir, with modern radar and missiles, does smoke obscuration still matter?" Pappy's answer became part of Top Gun doctrine. Technology changes, physics doesn't. The human eye still processes brightness and obscuration the same way it did in 1943. Radar can track through smoke, yes, but visual identification is still required before firing in many engagement scenarios. And the moment a fight becomes visual, smoke can still conceal. Your F4 generates smoke at certain throttle settings. Learn when, learn how to exploit it. The principles I used against Zeros work against MiGs. The students tested Pappy's assertion. During training exercises, F4 pilots deliberately generated smoke during defensive maneuvering. The results validated his point. Even with radar guidance, visual tracking was degraded when targets disappeared into self-generated smoke. Attacking pilots lost situational awareness, broke off engagements prematurely, made defensive decisions when offensive action was warranted. One of those students, who later became an admiral, said in a 2010 interview, "Pappy Boyington taught us that every characteristic of your aircraft, even the characteristics you consider flaws, can be weaponized if you understand them deeply enough. The F4's smoke, the F-15's contrails, the F-22's heat signature, these aren't just technical considerations, they're tactical tools. Pappy proved that in 1943, and it's still true today." In 2020, the Marine Corps published an updated tactics manual for the F-35C Lightning II. In the section on electronic warfare and signature management, there's a subsection titled Historical Precedent, Boyington Smoke Doctrine. It describes how Pappy turned the Corsair's exhaust smoke into tactical concealment and draws parallels to modern signature management, the deliberate control of radar, infrared, and visual emissions to create tactical advantage. The manual concludes, Major Boyington demonstrated that flaws can be features when properly exploited. His smoke obscuration technique, developed with 1943 technology, established principles that remain relevant in modern stealth operations. Control what the enemy perceives. Use your emissions strategically. Disappear when you need to disappear. Appear where you're not expected. These principles transcend technology and era.